The sky was dark when the disgraced aristocrat pulled open his heavy eyelids. A foul perfume of grass and rot overtook his nostrils as he inhaled. He looked down to see that he was laying on a grave with his head rested on a stone block, assumed to be its tombstone. He must have wandered into a cemetery during another one of his drunken stupors, though he could not remember why he had developed a habit for the grape to begin with. Pushing himself to his elbows, he looked down at the rags of his undergarments and scratched the whiskers growing from his chin, remembering how grand his attire had once been. Perhaps his habit had been the reason his people had cast him aside and completely forgot that he had once been a man of great importance in his beloved England, now reduced to pathetic peasantry. That must have been what happened. What was his title again? He could not remember. He reflected on how many times he had seen a homeless beggar on the street and had not paid them a second glance. Was there a possibility that they once held influence, as he once had? What would he have learned if he had simply taken the time to learn their name? And now he was one of them, as alone and forgotten as the poor soul whose grave he had used as his bed, struggling to remember his own name. He turned his eyes to the faded monument, but it was too dark to see the writing. The clouds must be concealing the moonlight this funereal evening. His eyes shifted to a massive profile hiding in the darkness. As his eyes began to adjust, he realized that it was a castle that appeared to be abandoned. Heaven's praise! A warm place to sleep, or at least a sheltered one. He could not recall much of his current situation, but the sickly sweet scent of rotting calla lilies lingering in the air reminded him that it was all Hallows Eve, and tonight was not the night to be caught outside when the dead begin their annual rumpus. He stumbled his way into the mansion, catching himself on a stone gargoyle erected on the stair railing. The estate was dark inside, though deceptively clean for a structure that appeared to be without life. Some unseen force drew him to the north wing, where he found a basin of water next to a table, where a sponge, a comb, and a straight razor had been placed. Laying on the ground near the corner was a rapier. The hilt rusted, and the blade discolored to a shade of brown. Something about this castle felt familiar to him. Had he taken shelter here before? He must have. The bed to the west of the room had the imprint of a body that matched his own. He must have slept here before, but he could not remember when. Damn his habitual drunkenness. He dipped his hand into the water of the basin to find that it was not only clean, but warm. A bit odd for a place that did not appear to be inhabited, but he knew it was always best not to look a gift horse in the mouth. He bathed, shaved, and combed his hair. Laying on a bedside table was a salmon-colored suit that appeared to be roughly his size, if not a bit loose, folded neatly as though it were placed deliberately. He donned the suit and looked at himself in a nearby mirror. He puffed out his chest proudly. It was the first time he had looked this regal since he had lost his title, whatever it had been. A strange feathered thing hanging from the mirror corner caught his eye. He retrieved it to inspect it, and saw that it was a mask. The visor itself was black with silver embellishments, and the feathers tucked into one side were royal purple and cardinal red. Such regal colors! He chuckled to himself and placed it on his visage. No doubt he was alone in such a place, so he had no reason to feel silly for such an adornment without reason. He looked at his image again. The mask completed the ensemble. It reminded him of the parties he often threw in his manor. One in particular came to mind. At least, he thought it was one of the parties. He remembered a blue rose and a banquet table, but it was only a fraction of a memory, and he had no other recollection beyond that. The memory of food panged his stomach like the tip of a blade. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten. He believed for a moment that his imagination was getting the best of him, because he thought he could smell cooked pheasant wafting in the air. But then he realized that it was no hallucination. It was, indeed, the redolence of food that had reached his nostrils. He followed the smell down to the ballroom. The room was dark, but he could make out the outline of a banquet table filled with all the foods he had missed since his insurrection. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief, but they were not deceiving him. His stomach ached again, and he strode briskly to the table to begin eating greedily. Suddenly, he heard a chilled voice pierce the silence behind him as he took a gulp of wine.
Early as usual, Augustus.
He spun around to see the silhouette of a man ambling his way to the stage. His black garments were a strange fashion, and he wore a mask that resembled that of a skull with a dark, wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Though surely a costume, something about the man unsettled him. He shook off his shock when it dawned on him what the stranger had called him. Augustus. That's right. That's his name. Augustus of Coventry. The shadowed figure moved to a table where a violin lay patiently in wait. He removed his matching gloves and placed them on the table to carefully caress the wooden bird between his pale fingers, and scratched a few notes to warm up his bow. Then Augustus remembered what the man had said.
Early? Early for what? What event could possibly be alive? Tonight of all nights.
The carillon of a nearby clock resonated through the hall, marking the stroke of midnight. The musician's mask remained in place as he plucked the strings, though Augustus could almost feel him smiling behind it.
The Hallows Masquerade, of course. You will have a grand time tonight. You always do.
With those words, he began to play a strange and macabre tune. As the music grew lively, all the candles in the large room caught light, and suddenly he was surrounded by life. Perhaps they had been there before, and he simply hadn't noticed anything besides his own hunger. Dozens of elegantly dressed regality were laughing and dancing to the sound of the dark musician's tune. A flock of petticoats floated across the floor like birds that made Augustus believe that he was in a dream. All the partygoers were adorned with masks of all the colors of a garden, and he suddenly remembered that he too was wearing one. It must have indeed been placed for him, along with the supplies in which to clean himself up, though there was no guessing of how they knew he would gravitate to the north wing. Across the room was a young woman, eating a cherry tart alone at the banquet table, watching the guests partaking in gaiety with their respective partners. Her gold dress stood out among the shades of azure costumes worn by the other women, though she wore a mask colored the same gilded yellow as her gown. Something about her eyes struck Augustus so familiar. He traipsed around the room, watching the disguised guests caper to the lively music, though he could not turn his eyes from the woman in gold for long. Unable to hesitate any longer, he made his way to her and bowed low, humbly asking if she would do him the honor of a dance. She smiled in response and allowed him to lead her to the floor. Her delicate hand felt so natural on his shoulder as he slipped his own around her waist, and the two allowed the music to carry them away. She moved with such poise as they drifted across the floor, and all time was lost to them. When the song had ended, she curtsied and thanked him for the pleasure, her satin voice lilting behind her thick foreign tongue.
That accent. It's French, is it not?
The woman smiled slyly. Oui. Connaissez-vous vous-même le français? This question tickled Augustus.
I know a little, but I hope you aren't offended if I continue to speak in my own tongue. I fear my French leaves something to be desired.
The woman giggled at this confession and lowered the visor from her powdered face. The envious moon shone through the window to illuminate a vision that even Venus herself could not contend with. A new melody rang through the hall as the dark musician continued to play. Augustus lowered his own mask to better gaze upon the beauty that stood before him. The look she gave him turned coy as her cheeks flushed, and he could not help but take her hand again to let their feet once more become puppets to the lively waltz. In the middle of the dance, her eyes glinted with a playful gleam, which made Augustus grin, thinking there was a bit of mischief hiding behind this golden Adonis. She took him by the hand to lead him out of the hall through an adjacent garden of blossoms until they came upon bushels of sapphire roses in full bloom.
I don't know how, but I knew those would be here. I love all roses, but blue ones have always been my favorite,
she said as she brushed her lips against the petals of one to breathe in its aromatic fragrances. Something about this woman was so enchanting, so intoxicating, so charming, so familiar. He plucked a rose from the bush and tucked it gently into her curls. Her eyes turned to him, sparkling like moonlight on the ocean. Compared to her, these roses were nothing more than common daisies. The music from the hall could still be heard in the garden, and the melody had reached a maudlin measure that seemed to draw them into a gentle sway as their hands were joined. Her ivory skin was like cream and silk in his hand, and she placed her head on his chest. The perfume of her hair caused his heart to pound within him. His tongue ran away from him, and he heard his own voice whisper, "Puis je veux embrasser? May I kiss you?" Her smile widened as she breathed, "Parfait," and she pressed her soft lips against his. She leaned her porcelain body into him as they kissed, and he wrapped his arms around her, hoping this moment would never break. He couldn't bear to think himself separated from lips so warm and familiar as she. Had they met before? The taste of cherry tart still lingered with Augustus after the kiss broke, and he inquired her name. Her lips parted to answer, but before she could respond, the gong of the grandfather resounded through the hall and cut through to the garden to indicate the inception of the 6th hour. Surely time could not have passed on this quickly. Hand in hand, the two found themselves drawn back into the ballroom, where the other guests were leaving the manor, their broken visors strewn across the shadowed floor, for the candles had melted down to the base and burned no more. The music had ceased, the food had rotted, and the once eloquent garments of the guests had decayed into nothing more than moth-eaten rags. Augustus turned his head when he felt his hand become empty, and found that the woman in gold had disappeared, vacant space haunting where she had once occupied. He followed the guests outside of the manor as the sky began to turn purple, illuminating their ghastly faces as they wandered into the cemetery, revealing the horror that Augustus could not have prepared himself for. Some had dark bruises around their necks, mingled with rope burn. Others had pustules all over their gaunt bodies that had burst and soaked fetid pus onto their rags. Others carried their head in their hands. Some bemoaned with sorrow, some traumatized with alarm, some implicit with acceptance. As he watched the congregation each walk to their selected grave, Augustus was paralyzed with shock as he realized that these were the dead that he was in the presence of the evening before. Smothered by fear, he turned his head quickly when he saw the dark musician moving in his peripheral, violin in his blanched hand. With the sun on his face, Augustus could now see that the eyes peering through his skull visor were without color.
The party has ended, Augustus. It's time to go home.
Looking out at all of the deceased, he could not stop himself from asking,
I have no home. Why is this happening? Where is the woman in gold?
The blind musician shook his head and replied,
She's not here. I allowed her to attend for an evening for your sake and for hers, as I do every year. But this is not her final resting place, as is yours.
Augustus felt agony return to his stomach, and he looked down to see himself covered in what appeared to be his own blood. His garbs had once again become soil-ridden scraps, and his whiskers had returned. He looked like the same broken beggar as he had the previous evening. He followed the musician's outstretched finger, leading his eyes to the writing carved on the stone that he found himself laying on. Here lies Duke Augustus of Coventry, born August 1323, died September 1347. Abit autem non sum oblitus. Trembling at the sudden revelation of his demise, he then remembered everything. He had suffered a great tragedy that had absolutely destroyed him. What was the tragedy that he... Estelle. He had received word that she had taken ill with plague and that her last days were near. He hadn't even bothered fully dressing before practically flying on his horse all the way to her Paris manor in the pouring rain to see his dying intended, barely making it to her bedside before her passing. His lament had lasted the length of the day, even striking the servant girl at one point. He was so distraught that he could not even fully process what she had said to him or why he felt it necessary to strike her for it. Then when he returned home to this very castle, he fell into a wine mason and stayed there. His binging had lasted for what must have been months until, one day, he could handle his sorrow no longer. He locked himself in his bedchamber in the north wing and plunged his rapier into his own belly. He remembered that Estelle was so charming and enchanting and looked very much like the woman in gold. That's where he had felt those lips before. The woman in gold was Estelle. He had held his beloved in his arms once again and he had not even known. And now she's gone. Gone back to her ashy resting place among the masses of the diseased, burned away like infected firewood. Gone away from him while he lies in the luxury of a proper burial mound. Broken once again, Augustus collapsed in despair and crawled like an animal to his grave. He crumbled upon his tombstone, allowing a cascade of tears to stream down his grim cheeks as his spirit faded into the rising sun. Death watched as the sun faded the spirits of all who lay in the graveyard above their respective resting places. He doesn't have any control of how they each take to the news of being dead, but he can at least give them the comfort of merriment, if even for just one night, as he does every year. Though lonely as he is, he doesn't often involve himself with the living. But he knew that Augustus would have been even lonelier in death if he had not sent him word that Estelle had caught plague in his life and allowed him to spend one last moment with his love before he claimed her. Augustus would never know that it was Death who had sent him the letter. Not that he would have remembered anyway if he had told him. Every year, he dies again when he remembers, then promptly forgets when he returns to the metaphysical domain. Death looked down to see a newspaper blow by his feet with the front page headline, "Remembering Queen Elizabeth II." In the distance, he saw a woman wearing a paper mask over her mouth while she walked her dog through the ancient cemetery. The dog looked directly at him and started whining and pulling on its leash. The woman reeled alertly in response with eyes turned in his direction, but he knew she couldn't see him, as it wasn't her time yet. He brushed the drizzle off his dark trench coat and walked back into the dilapidated, moss-covered castle to replace his violin on its table. He ambled somberly from the old castle, pulling his black gloves over his fatal hands, knowing that his wooden bird would still be waiting for its turn to sing once again at the next Hallows Masquerade.